Hello, and welcome to 5 Minutes of Postgres. My name is Lucas, and today we're going to talk about explaining generic plans in Postgres 16. This is a blog post by Lawrence Alba on the Cybertech blog, where he talks about a feature that he contributed to Postgres 16. First of all, what do we mean by generic plan? Generic plans are a variant of a query plan that are independent of the actual parameter values. For example, when you use a prepared statement with different parameter values, Postgres has certain logic that on the 6th execution, it will decide whether to rely on a generic plan versus make custom plans for each set of parameters. And this can provide performance benefits, also downsides depending on certain situations. But the other interesting aspect of generic plans is that they can give you an explain plan without requiring the parameter values. There is a way to do this in earlier Postgres versions. Lawrence previously talked about this in a blog post, and we also had a 5 Minutes of Postgres episode on this topic, where you can use the plan cache mode feature in Postgres to force a generic plan. This way, you prepare a statement and then you make sure the prepared statement always uses a generic plan. That way, you can explain statements that, for example, contain a $1 parameter without you actually setting a particular value of $1. In Postgres 16, Tom Lane recently committed Lawrence's patch, which adds a generic plan option for explain. The idea is to make it simpler, not to have to use this workaround of plan cache mode, but instead officially offer this as an option as part of explain. There's also a small improvement here, which was not possible previously, which is sometimes execution time partition pruning kicks in, and then there was potential errors in the previous logic. Now with this official option, you can actually get a generic plan for your query. Let's take a closer look at what that means. In Postgres 16, what you will be able to do is you will be able to say explain, and you'll give the generic plan option, and then you give your query, for example, a select statement. This is similar to how a regular explain works, but the big difference is that if you have a statement like rel name equals $1, we are actually able to get an explain plan for the statement without needing to set the value of $1. In previous versions, what would have happened if you just ran explain, for example, it would have actually told you there is no parameter $1. Postgres would normally expect the query to have all these parameters set. Now, why is this useful? It seems kind of obscure. In reality, what often happens when you're debugging a particular query is you'll get the query from one of two locations. Either you'll get it from the Postgres logs, or you'll get it from pgstat statements. In the case of the Postgres logs, for example, let's say you have a statement timeout. There are settings in your Postgres versions to also output the parameter values, but many times you don't actually have them. And so it becomes useful to be able to get a generic query plan just from that statement. Similarly, pgstat statement always records what it calls normalized statements. And again, these contain $1, $2, and such replacement values. And so you're not actually able to get the actual values from pgstat statements. For that, you would have to use another extension. And so what this explain generic plan feature now allows you to do is just take the query text from pgstat statements, add explain generic plan in front of it, and then it gives you an idea of how the statement might perform. As Lawrence notes here, for full analysis, you definitely still want to do an explain analyze buffers, for example. But for that to be able to run, you would actually need to know the appropriate parameter values. Also important to note, sometimes Postgres query plans will be different depending on which parameter values you have. It can't be that if you have a very common value that's common in a table, you'll get a different index scan than if you have a very infrequently used value. This selectivity calculation that Postgres does can greatly influence query plans. There's a couple of limitations of this new feature that are important to note. First of all, you can't just use these parameters everywhere. It has to be in a place where you can currently use a constant value in Postgres, a string, for example, or a number. You couldn't just say from $1 being the table name, because Postgres couldn't plan that. Similarly, you can't just replace a whole clause. You could say where $1, but that would essentially just be the same as saying where true or something. It's nonsensical to really replace full parts of a query with that. The other thing to note is that sometimes you might run into data type problems. For example, the generate series function actually has multiple definitions for different data types. If you just set generate series with $1, $2, $3, it wouldn't actually work because it would complain that there's multiple functions and Postgres wouldn't know which one you meant. There is a workaround. Either you could fall back to the old style of doing this with an actual prepare, and then you can specify the data types as part of the prepare. Or what I personally would recommend, if you can, is to actually modify the query and add an explicit typecast. If you had that typecast, for example, in your application code, it would actually get recorded this way in pgstat statements or the Postgres log as well. That way, you can make sure that generic plans can be explained consistently for your queries, which is very useful to get a good sense of how your workload is structured. All in all, I think this is a very useful feature, and I look forward to using it in Postgres 16. Thank you so much for listening. This was 5 Minutes of Postgres. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear about next week's episode, and talk to you next week.